The morning she said it, I had been sitting in the same corner of the pressed cup for almost 2 years. Long enough that the barista knew my order before I reached the counter. Long enough that the hiss of the espresso machine had become the unofficial starting pistol of every working day. Long enough that I thought I understood, with the comfortable certainty of a man who had arranged his life very carefully, exactly who he was and what he wanted from the people in it. Which, if I am being entirely honest, was not very much. I was a man who had learned to want just slightly less than enough, and to call that balance. What I did not know, not yet, was that the woman behind that counter had been paying attention to me with a precision I could not have guessed, and had quietly reached a conclusion I was not prepared to hear. That Tuesday in March, she set the cup down in front of me, and I wrapped both hands around the ceramic the way I always did, and brought it to my lips and took the first sip without even glancing up from the document on my laptop. And then I stopped, because something was different. Not dramatically different, not in a way I could have described to anyone who asked, but different in the way that certain things are different. The specific, almost physical sensation of something being exactly right. The temperature sat in that narrow window between comfort and burn that most coffee shops never bother to find. The foam was light, almost weightless on top of the espresso, sitting there like it had decided on its own to be precisely that way. And the ratio of it all, the milk to the shot, the quiet sweetness of oat against the deep pull of a well-timed extraction, hit me the way a song hits you when it comes on at the right moment of a drive and you were not expecting to feel anything at all. I looked up at her without planning to. And I said the thing I always said when something caught me off guard and made me briefly grateful to be alive. Marry me. It was a joke. It had always been a joke. I had said it to my grandmother's pot roast at Christmas. I had said it to a parking space that appeared on a rainy Thursday afternoon when I was already 8 minutes late. It was the kind of reflex that lives in the same part of the brain that produces involuntary smiles. Nothing more considered than that, just the verbal shape of an unexpected delight. Nora had heard it before. I was fairly certain of that, at least twice when she had nailed the temperature just right. Once when she had placed a cinnamon twist on the saucer without my asking. Each time she had laughed the way people laugh at a small, familiar joke that costs them nothing, and moved to the next customer, and we had both forgotten it by the time I reached my corner table. But this time she didn't laugh. She looked at me for a moment that lasted a beat longer than I expected, and she was not uncomfortable, not irritated, not playing at anything. She was just very still and very direct, the way people look when they have decided to say something they actually mean. Her dark eyes held mine, and she spoke in a voice quiet enough that only I could hear it over the sound of the grinder running behind the counter. Ask me again when you're ready. That was all. Then she turned and handed the next person in line their order, and the morning kept moving like nothing had shifted at all. I sat at that corner table for 40 minutes. I did not write a single word. Let me take you back to before that morning, because you need to understand what my life looked like from the outside, to understand how 4 words from a woman I saw 3 times a week could reach all the way through the chest and rearrange something that had been very deliberately set. My name is Owen Hartley. I am 31 years old. I live in a 1-bedroom apartment in Portland, Oregon, in a building where the elevator has not worked reliably in 6 months and the radiator ticks through the night like it is counting something. I work as a freelance copywriter, which is the professional way of saying I write things that other people put their names on and I get paid just enough to not have to think about money with my full attention. I have 4 houseplants that have survived despite me rather than because of me. I have a friend named Marcus who tells me every few months over cheap beer that I need to let a real human being into my life before I fossilize. And I always nod the way you nod when someone says something you have already heard the truth in and chosen to set aside. My apartment is tidy. That is important to know. It is the apartment of a man who has learned to keep things organized in the absence of anyone else to organize them around. There is a desk by the window where I work until the light changes. There is a shelf of books I have read and a laptop with a novel on it that has been in progress since before I moved in, currently sitting at 19 pages, 2 of which I know are beyond saving. I make good coffee at home, but I go to the pressed cup anyway, 3 mornings a week, rain or shine, because there is something about working inside a room where other people are also present and also working that makes the loneliness feel like a choice rather than a condition. I discovered that distinction about 6 months after my last relationship ended, and I have never bothered to question it since. I started going to the Pressed Cup because it was 2 blocks from my apartment and because the windows faced east. That mattered. Morning light coming in at the right angle through glass is one of the things that makes it easier to believe in what you are working on. Chain coffee places had overhead fluorescents that flattened everything, including ideas. The Pressed Cup had 12 tables, chairs that did not quite match, a chalkboard menu that changed with the season, and walls painted a color somewhere between sage and slate that I could never precisely name but found oddly settling. I became a regular within the first week. By the second week, the woman behind the counter had already memorized my order. I noticed Nora Walsh the way you notice good weather in November. Not with focused attention, but with the part of you that registers when the environment has quietly become better than expected. She was 28, though she had the quality that some people have of existing slightly outside the age you would assign them, both older and younger at once. She had brown hair she kept in a low knot at the back of her neck most mornings, and a small scar above her left eyebrow that I started looking for the way you look for a familiar landmark on a road you have driven so often it has become automatic. She moved behind the counter without wasted motion, not rushed and not slow, just precise in the way that suggested she had stopped needing to think about where things were a long time ago. There was a quietness to how she operated that I found myself, without entirely meaning to, taking note of. Our conversation in those first several months was the ordinary currency of regular proximity. Weather. Brief mentions of weekends that neither of us elaborated on. Book recommendations exchanged across the counter in the lulls between orders. I learned she was finishing a night program in architecture at Portland State, going 2 evenings a week after shifts. I learned she grew up in a town in southern Oregon called Talent, which I told her was possibly the best town name in the history of American geography, and she told me she had spent most of her childhood failing to find it funny. I learned she drank her own coffee black, no additions, the way people do when they have stopped needing coffee to be anything other than what it actually is. She learned that I was a writer with a novel that had been in progress longer than most dogs live and currently existed in a state she diplomatically called ambitious in scope. She did not laugh when I told her about the 19 pages, she just said, 19 is more than 0. I thought about that sentence for the rest of the day and, if I am being fully honest, for several weeks after whenever the document sat unopened on my desk. What I did not do, during any of those months, was allow myself to think about her in any way that moved past the warmly lit, professionally maintained category of pleasant regular. I was very accomplished at not doing that. I had learned that skill 4 years earlier when a woman named Claire had sat across from me at a restaurant on a wet night in November and told me, with the particular steadiness of someone who has thought carefully about what they are about to say, that she loved me but that she could not keep loving a man who lived as though his real life was still coming, as though everything around him, including her, was preliminary. "You have 1 foot in every room you're in," she had said, "and the whole way in none of them. I want someone who actually arrives." I had stayed very still while she said it. I had not argued because I knew, in the specific, humiliating clarity of hearing the truth that you have already known about yourself and chosen to ignore, that she was right. And then I had built the most careful, quietly organized, thoroughly secure case for never being in that position again, which looked from the outside like a content, uncomplicated, modestly productive life, and felt from the inside like a very clean room with no windows. So no, I was not thinking about Nora in any way that cost me anything. I was just a man who liked a particular coffee shop for perfectly sensible reasons. And then she said 4 words, and sensible stopped applying. The week after that Tuesday, I came in on my regular schedule, and both times she served me exactly as she always had. Efficient, warm, perfectly calibrated to the right professional distance. She remembered the order. The cinnamon twist appeared on the saucer without discussion. She asked how the novel was going, and I told her I had reached page 21, and she smiled in that unhurried, genuine way she smiled at everything, and I was quietly losing my mind in a corner chair. I could not stop turning those 4 words over. "Ask me again when you're ready." She had said it like something that had been waiting to be said for a while, like an answer to a question she had been holding long before I asked it. On the Friday of that week, when she came to clear the table next to mine during a lull between rushes, I looked up and just said it, as calmly as I could, which was not as calmly as I would have liked. "What did you mean by it, the other day, what you said?" She did not pretend not to know what I was talking about. She folded the cloth in her hands and held my gaze and said, "I meant exactly what I said." Then she moved to the next table. I sat with my hands on my keyboard and stared at page 21 and understood nothing. What changed after that conversation was not dramatic. There was no moment I can point to and say, that is when I began paying different attention. It was gradual, the way the light changes in spring, incrementally warmer, until one morning you step outside and understand that something has shifted without being able to identify the exact day it happened. I started noticing things I had been letting sit at the edge of my awareness without looking at directly. The way she handled a man who came in one Thursday morning and snapped at her because his order had taken 4 minutes and he had somewhere to be. She did not shrink and she did not match his tone. She looked at him with a complete absence of defensiveness and said, "I'll have that remade for you right away." When he took his drink and left without any acknowledgement, she turned back to the counter and did not sigh or roll her eyes or say anything to her coworker. She just continued. I had spent years writing things designed to understand what made people tick, and something about the way she had done that, without armor, without the performance of patience that is still secretly irritated, told me more about who she was than all the months of pleasant conversation had. I started noticing Martin. He came in every day at 11 with the careful movements of a man who had not slept enough for a while, and he always ordered decaf and always paid an exact change and always found a shortbread cookie on his saucer that she never charged for and neither of them ever mentioned. I noticed Sophie, the graduate student who arrived at 1 with a bag full of papers and stayed until closing and found a fresh glass of water on her table at 3 without having asked for one. I started to understand that Nora Walsh ran through the shop like a current you couldn't see directly but could feel in the quality of the air, and that the room felt specifically different on the mornings she wasn't there. I noticed something else too, and named it reluctantly. A man named Derek had been coming in more frequently. Late 30s, the easy, broad-shouldered confidence of someone who had never been told no in a situation that actually mattered to him. He ordered Americanos and found reasons to stay at the counter longer than it took to pay for one. I watched him make her laugh one morning, her head tilting slightly back, that specific laugh she had where she seemed surprised by her own amusement, and felt something move through my chest that I chose not to look at directly because I did not have the right to look at it directly. I was a man with both feet planted just outside every room he stood in. I went back to my laptop and wrote page 24. The partial answer arrived on a Saturday in early May. The shop was in that quiet between 9 and 10 when the first rush had emptied out and the brunch crowd had not yet arrived. I was the only person at the back tables. Nora came out from behind the counter with her own black coffee and a folder of architectural drawings and sat down across from me like it required no explanation. I looked up. She said, "My break. You're not paying rent for the table." I laughed. She opened the folder. We sat like that for about 20 minutes, both of us working, not saying much, and it was the most comfortable I had felt in any room that was not my own apartment in a long time. Then she said, not looking up from a line she was drawing, "The person I was supposed to marry said he loved me every single day. He was very good at saying it, he just wasn't very good at being there." I went still. She continued in the same matter-of-fact voice, not performing the sadness, just stating it. "He ended it the week before the wedding, by text message. He said he wasn't sure he was ready. After 4 years, and a venue deposit, and my mother's dress that had already been altered, and 300 invitations that had already been sent." She paused, and her pencil moved along a measured line. So when I say ask me again when you're ready, I don't mean ready as in having everything sorted. I mean ready as in actually intending to stay. There's a difference. Most people confuse them. She closed the folder, stood up, and went back behind the counter. She did not look at me again before I left. I sat for another 45 minutes without opening my laptop. I understood something in that stretch of time that I had not been willing to look at before. She was not being guarded. She was not playing a game, not testing me, not setting up some elaborate emotional barrier she secretly wanted someone to dismantle. She had looked at me across 2 years of ordinary Tuesday and Friday mornings and seen something clearly, and she had told me the truth of it. She had watched a man be warm and present and pleasantly engaged with his surroundings right up to the precise point where being present might require something from him. She had watched me keep every interaction, every conversation, every possible connection at exactly the temperature of nice, warm enough to be comfortable, never hot enough to matter. And she had said, very gently without malice, I see the shape of you, and I am telling you exactly what it would take. I went home and stood in my apartment and looked at the 4 half-alive houseplants and the organized surfaces and the laptop with its 24 pages, and I thought about Claire's words for the 100th time. Not the words themselves anymore, I had those memorized, but the feeling underneath them, that specific sorrow of someone who had wanted to love me fully and found they were loving a man who was only half there, and had eventually had to love themselves enough to leave. I thought about my father, who had died when I was 26 without warning, and how his death had rearranged my understanding of permanence in a way I had never properly examined. How instead of making me hold tighter to what I had, it had made me hold everything more loosely, under the theory that if I never gripped anything with my full weight I could survive the shock of losing it. I thought about how I had called this protection, how it was not. I started showing up differently after that. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone watching from the outside would have clocked as a change. I came in a little more often. I let conversations go longer. I started asking Nora real questions, the kind that required actual thought to answer, not just pleasantries you could exchange without looking at each other. She told me about what she wanted to design and why. Small homes, specifically, not luxury developments or commercial towers. She said most people did not need more space, they needed better space. Rooms that understood what they were for. Windows positioned where you actually spent your time. A kitchen with enough room to cook in properly, because a kitchen that worked changed how a family related to itself. I told her that was the most honest thing I had heard anyone say about their professional ambitions in years. She tilted her head in the way she did when she was listening carefully and said, "But what do you want to build?" I did not have an answer, but the fact that she had waited for one, patiently, with no agenda in her eyes, did something to my chest I could not account for and was not quite brave enough to name yet. The Thursday before the 4th of July, I came in and she was not there. A different barista took my order and told me she had taken family leave. Her mother was unwell. She did not know when Nora would be back. I ordered my coffee. I sat in my corner. I worked through the morning and went home and told myself this was fine. It was fine. People had families. People had mothers. Lives extended in directions that did not involve the coffee shop where I liked to work. This was completely fine. She was not there Friday. Not there Monday. I found myself going in more often that second week, which I recognized as irrational and continued doing anyway. 3 weeks passed. Then 4, then 5. I sat at the corner table under the east-facing light and worked and drank coffee that was perfectly good and thought about something Marcus had said to me years ago when I had told him I was not the kind of person who needed people around to function. He had looked at me with the patient expression of someone watching a friend misread a map and said, "Everyone needs people around to function. The question is whether you notice it before or after they're gone." I started to notice it, not in an abstract, general way, in a specific, particular, embarrassingly precise way. The room was the same room. The coffee was the same coffee. The morning light came through the east windows at the same angle it always had. But something that made the room worth sitting in had been removed, and I could not pretend, even to myself, that what was missing was just a pleasant daily routine. I had been coming here for 2 years for the espresso temperature and the good light and the comfortable table. And also, it turned out, for the specific unrepeatable quality of spending time in a room where a particular person was present and paying attention. You don't always know what a thing is until you're in the version of it where the thing is absent. I wrote 23 pages while she was gone. I went from 24 to 47 in 6 weeks, which was more than I had written in the previous year combined. I thought about the question she had asked me, "What do you want to build?" And I understood, somewhere in those 6 weeks, that I had been starting to try to answer it. Not just in the novel, in general. She came back on a Wednesday in early August. I walked in and she was behind the counter, and I felt the specific, quiet weight of 6 weeks of absence arrive in my chest all at once, like a door that had been held slightly open finally being allowed to close properly. She looked thinner. She had the look of someone who had been through something that was not finished with them yet, a particular quality of having been stretched and not quite returned to the original shape. When she saw me, she gave me a small, real smile that did not try to be larger than it was. "The usual?" she said. "Please," I said. I did not ask about her mother that morning. I ordered, I sat down, I worked, and when she came by to clear the table beside mine, I looked up without making it into anything and said quietly, "I'm glad you're back." She stopped, held that for a second. "Me too," she said. Then she moved on. Her mother had died in late July. She told me 3 weeks after she returned, on a slow morning when she came and sat across from me during her break with her black coffee and no folder, just her hands around the cup. She talked, and I listened. I did not try to steer the conversation toward comfort or say the things people say when they want grief to wrap up sooner than it intends to. She told me they had known for 2 years that this was coming. She said the knowing had not helped in the way she had hoped it would. You could spend 2 years learning the shape of a wave, she said, and it still knocked you flat when it arrived. I told her about my father. Not the short version I gave to people I did not know well, but the actual version. How his death had taught me that things I had treated as permanent were not, and how instead of making me hold tighter to the people I had, it had somehow done the opposite. How I had convinced myself that keeping a loose grip on everything was a form of wisdom rather than a form of fear. She listened the way she did everything, without preparing her response while I was still talking, without reaching for the next thing to say. And then she said, very quietly and with no drama in it at all, "That's not protection, that's just a longer kind of loss." She was not being unkind. She never was. She was just exact. I went home that night and sat at my desk in the dark for a long time before I turned the light on. I thought about those words. I thought about Derek, who I had heard asking for her number 2 days earlier. My back turned, the shop quiet enough to carry sound farther than I wanted. She had not said no. She had said she was still finding her footing after a lot of things, which was not a no. And I had been sitting with that the way you sit with smoke, trying to convince yourself it was nothing to worry about while knowing, on some level, that somewhere nearby something was burning. I called Marcus that night and told him approximately everything. He listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him, and when I finished he was quiet for a moment and then said, "Owen, you have been ready for months. You're just scared of what happens if you actually try." I sat with that. It settled somewhere between my ribs. "Yeah," I said, "I know." And Marcus said, "So stop knowing it and do something about it." I showed up early the following Thursday, before the morning rush when the shop held only 2 or 3 people and the light came through the east windows at that low, honey-colored angle that made the whole room feel like something out of a photograph someone took on accident and couldn't explain why it was beautiful. I sat in my usual corner. I opened my laptop and stared at page 47 without reading a word of it. When Nora came over and set my coffee down herself, bypassing the junior barista who had started doing the morning rounds, I looked up before she could step away. I said, "I want to say something. And I need you to know I'm not joking this time." She went completely still. Behind the counter, the espresso machine kept running. Outside on the street, a bicycle passed. She looked at me with those level, dark, unhurried eyes and she waited. "I know what I want to build," I said. My voice was steadier than I had any right to expect. I've known for a while, honestly, and I've been doing the thing I always do, staying close enough to something to tell myself I'm working on it, without ever getting close enough to actually risk anything. That's the thing I'm good at. It's the thing I've been good at my whole adult life. I looked at her. The morning light was sitting on the side of her face. I'm not ready in the sense of having everything figured out. I'm not sure that version of ready actually exists, but I'm ready in the way you meant. I intend to stay. I stopped. I waited. She looked at me for a moment that stretched and then softened. Something shifted in her expression. Not dramatically, not the way these things happen in films where there are always strings playing underneath. Just quietly, like a window that has been painted shut for too long, that someone has finally pushed open. "Yes," she said, that simply. That plainly. "Yes, I want to tell you the rest of it honestly because love that is worth the name does not arrive completed." Our first real date was awkward for the first 30 minutes in the specific way things are awkward when they matter enough to be capable of going wrong. We had an argument 4 months in about something small that turned out to be about something large. The fact that when things between us got difficult I still went quiet sometimes, still retreated into the apartment and the pages and the organized silence I had been maintaining for years. She told me. Not with anger, just with the honesty she brought to everything, precise and without malice, the same way she had said that's a longer kind of loss. I sat with it. I did not defend myself or explain it away. And then, the next morning I came back. That was the turn, not the argument. The coming back, that is what I needed to understand about the word ready, it turned out. Not that it meant arriving with nothing left to work on, healed and certain and completely formed. It meant choosing, again, each time the old reflex pulled me toward the exit. It meant both feet in the room even when part of me, the old, practiced, carefully constructed part, still wanted to keep one foot at the door. Being ready was not a destination. It was a decision you made every morning. The way you decide to show up for work you care about even when the page in front of you feels impossible. The way you water a plant even when you have forgotten it so many times you are not sure it still wants to survive. You just do it again. You keep doing it. And slowly, the thing you keep choosing starts to believe you mean it. Nora finished her architecture program the following spring. I went to the presentation on a Thursday evening and sat in the back of the room and watched her explain a community housing project she had designed. Small units, shared kitchen space that was large enough to actually cook in, a garden plot that residents would tend collectively because she had written in her notes that tending something together changed the way people related to sharing anything. West-facing windows for afternoon light in the common spaces, hallways wide enough that 2 people passing could do so without turning sideways. The room was quiet while she spoke. Not politely quiet, actually quiet. The quality of quiet that happens when people are genuinely listening to someone who knows what they are talking about and means it. I sat in the back with my arms crossed and I felt something arrive in my chest that took me a moment to identify correctly. It was pride. Not the proud of you pride you feel for someone you are responsible for. The rarer kind, the proud to know you kind. The kind that makes you understand what it means to be allowed to be in the room when someone becomes the version of themselves they have been building toward. We moved in together in October. Her things and my 4 houseplants. She put the plants on the kitchen windowsill within the first 3 days and made them a watering schedule and put it on the refrigerator. I told her it was the single most meaningful thing she had done for our relationship. She told me it was the bare minimum and I should consider carefully what that said about me. I considered it. She was right, and I watered the plants, and they started, improbably, to look like they intended to keep living. I finished the novel in November. 47 pages became 70, became a complete draft, became something I printed out on a Sunday morning and left on the kitchen table without announcement. She picked it up while I was cooking something for the first time in years. Actual cooking, not reheating. And I looked over from the stove and she was on page 3 with an expression I had never quite seen her wear before. Concentrated. A little surprised, the way you look when you find something valuable in a place you were not expecting to find anything. The dedication read, "For N, who asked me what I wanted to build." She looked up. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she set the pages down and walked over and put her arms around me from behind while I stirred something on the stove, and she just stayed there. We stood like that in the kitchen with the morning coming through the window and something on the burner that smelled like it might actually turn into a real meal. I thought about the Tuesday in March when she had set a cup of coffee down in front of me and said 4 words in a voice low enough that only I could hear them. I thought about how I had sat at that corner table for 40 minutes without writing a single word and had not understood, not yet, that what had happened was not a strange, uncomfortable thing. What had happened was someone telling me the truth about myself in the only language that had a chance of reaching me. Some people learn what they need by having things taken from them. Some people learn it by receiving something they were not prepared to know they wanted. I learned it the slow way. The way I had always done everything, incrementally, with more resistance than was necessary, arriving at the obvious conclusion approximately 6 months after I should have. But I arrived. That is the part that turned out to matter. Not the grace of the journey but the fact of the destination and the decision every morning since to stay. She still makes the coffee at home on the mornings I am deep in work and have not moved from my desk for too long. She sets it on the corner of the desk and I look up. And sometimes I say it, still, the way I always did, the reflex, the involuntary thing, the verbal shape of unexpected gratitude. "Marry me." And she leans down and presses her lips to the top of my head and she says, very quietly, just for me, "You asked." Yes, that is the whole of it. The asking, the meaning it, and the choosing every morning to ask again.